The sun was setting over the rocky hills of Afghanistan when Captain Mike Rodriguez received the order that would change everything. His radio crackled to life in the dusty command post, and the voice on the other end was crystal clear. "Move your battalion to Sector 7 immediately. Intelligence reports enemy activity in the area." Rodriguez looked at his map, tracing his finger along the route. Sector 7 was a narrow valley surrounded by high cliffs on both sides. It was the kind of place where ambushes happened, where good soldiers went to die. But orders were orders, and 480 Marines under his command were ready to move. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen sat cleaning her rifle in the corner of the base camp. She had been with this unit for 8 months, and her reputation as a sniper was already legendary among the troops. At 26 years old, she could hit a target from over 1,000 yards away even in the worst weather conditions. The other Marines respected her skills, even though some of the older soldiers still weren't used to having a woman in combat roles. "Pack it up, Chen," Rodriguez called out. "We're moving out in 30 minutes. Sarah nodded, securing her specialized rifle and checking her gear one final time. Something felt wrong about this mission, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. The intelligence seemed too convenient, too perfect. In her experience, the enemy rarely made themselves so obvious. As the Marines loaded into their vehicles, Rodriguez studied the mission briefing again. They were supposed to clear out a suspected weapons cache in an abandoned village. It should have been a routine operation, but the valley location bothered him. Any military leader with half a brain would know that valley was a death trap. The convoy began moving just as darkness fell. Humvees and transport trucks rolled through the desert, carrying 480 Marines toward what they believed would be another successful mission. The soldiers joked and talked quietly among themselves, unaware that they were driving straight into the most dangerous night of their military careers. Sarah rode in the lead vehicle, her trained eyes scanning the landscape through night vision goggles. She had learned to trust her instincts during her time in combat zones, and right now those instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. The hills seemed too quiet, and there were no signs of civilian activity in areas where people usually lived. "Sir," she said to Rodriguez over the radio, "something doesn't feel right about this area." "What do you mean, Chen?" Rodriguez responded, his voice crackling through the static. "It's too quiet. No animals, no people, nothing moving out there. In my experience, that usually means someone cleared the area on purpose." Rodriguez considered her words carefully. Sarah had proven herself to be an excellent soldier with sharp instincts. If she was concerned, maybe he should be too. But they had their orders, and turning back now would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give his commanding officers. "Stay alert, everyone," he announced over the radio to all units. "Keep your eyes open and weapons ready." The convoy continued deeper into the valley, moving slowly along the winding road. On both sides, steep cliffs rose up like walls, creating perfect positions for enemy fighters to hide and attack from above. It was exactly the kind of terrain that military textbooks warned against entering without proper reconnaissance. As they reached the deepest part of the valley, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were small reflections of light coming from multiple positions in the cliffs above them, barely visible even through her night vision equipment. She had seen those same reflections before, and she knew exactly what they meant. "Contact. We have enemy positions in the cliffs," she shouted into her radio. But it was already too late. The first explosion lit up the night sky as a rocket-propelled grenade struck the lead vehicle. Within seconds, the entire valley erupted in gunfire from dozens of hidden positions. The 480 Marines found themselves trapped in the bottom of a valley, surrounded by enemy fighters who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Rodriguez realized immediately that they had walked straight into a carefully planned ambush. The intelligence had been fake, designed to lure them into this death trap. Now his Marines were fighting for their lives against an enemy that held every possible advantage. Chaos erupted in the valley as bullets rained down from every direction. The Marines scrambled for cover behind their damaged vehicles, but there was nowhere to hide from the deadly crossfire. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves perfectly along both cliff faces, creating a killing field that trapped the entire battalion. Rodriguez dove behind his command vehicle as machine gun fire shredded the metal around him. He tried to establish communication with his units, but several radio operators had already been hit in the first wave of attacks. The carefully planned ambush had caught them completely off guard, and now they were paying the price for trusting bad intelligence. "We need to get out of this valley," he shouted to his communications officer, Corporal Jackson, who was crouched beside him with blood running down his arm from shrapnel wounds. "Sir, we can't move the vehicles."
"They've got the road blocked with heavy weapons fire,"
Jackson replied, wincing as another explosion rocked their position. Sarah Chen had taken cover behind a large boulder about 50 yards from the main convoy. From her position, she could see the muzzle flashes from at least 30 different enemy positions scattered across the cliffs. The attackers had night vision equipment and seemed to know exactly where every Marine was located. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a perfectly orchestrated massacre. Through her scope, she began identifying priority targets. There was a machine gun nest about 800 yards up the eastern cliff that was causing the most damage to her fellow Marines. The gunner was protected by rocks, but she could see a small opening where she might be able to take a shot. She steadied her breathing, adjusted for wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The enemy machine gunner dropped instantly, but within seconds another fighter took his place. For every enemy she eliminated, 2 more seemed to appear from hidden positions. The Marines were running low on ammunition, and several vehicles were completely destroyed. Medical supplies were scattered across the valley floor, making it nearly impossible to treat the growing number of wounded soldiers. The situation was becoming more desperate with each passing minute. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, Rodriguez's second-in-command, crawled over to where Sarah was positioned. He had taken command of the eastern flank, but his men were pinned down and unable to advance or retreat. "Chen, we need you to find us a way out of here," he said urgently. "You've got the best eyes in this unit. What do you see?" Sarah scanned the cliffs methodically, looking for any weakness in the enemy positions. The attackers had clearly spent weeks, maybe months, preparing this ambush. They had ammunition stockpiles, predetermined firing positions, and escape routes planned. But she noticed something that might give the Marines a chance. "Sir, there's a narrow path on the western cliff about 2 clicks north of our position," she reported. "It looks like they're using it to move supplies and reinforcements. If we could get a small team up there, we might be able to hit them from behind." Mitchell shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Anyone trying to reach that path would be exposed to fire from both sides of the valley." "Not if they move during the next mortar attack," Sarah replied. "I can provide covering fire, and the explosions will give us some concealment." Before Mitchell could respond, a new sound filled the valley that made every Marine's heart sink. It was the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar shells, followed by a series of devastating explosions that shook the ground and sent debris flying in all directions. The enemy had brought heavy artillery into the fight, and now they were systematically destroying every piece of cover the Marines had found. Rodriguez realized that his battalion was facing complete annihilation unless they could find a way to break out of the trap within the next hour. "All units, this is actual," he broadcast over the radio using his command designation. "We are in a compromised position with heavy casualties. Request immediate air support and emergency extraction." The response that came back over the radio was devastating. "Negative on air support. Weather conditions have grounded all aircraft. You are on your own until further notice." For the first time in his military career, Captain Rodriguez felt true despair. His 480 Marines were trapped, outnumbered, and running out of time. The enemy had planned this ambush perfectly, even accounting for weather conditions that would prevent rescue operations. Sarah continued to engage targets, but she knew that picking off individual enemies wouldn't be enough to save her fellow Marines. They needed a miracle, and she was starting to realize that she might be the only one who could provide it. The mortar attacks grew more intense as the enemy fighters realized the Marines had no way to escape. Each explosion sent clouds of dust and rock fragments through the air, making it even harder for the trapped soldiers to see their attackers or coordinate their defense. Sarah wiped blood from a cut on her forehead and continued studying the enemy positions through her scope. She had counted at least 60 fighters spread across both cliff faces, but she suspected there were many more hidden in caves and behind rock formations. The attackers were using military tactics and equipment that suggested they were well-trained and well-supplied. Sergeant First Class Tommy Williams crawled up beside her, dragging his wounded leg behind him. He was one of the unit's demolitions experts, and his left arm was in a makeshift sling from shrapnel wounds. "Chen, I've got an idea, but it's crazy," he whispered, trying to stay below the enemy sight lines. "I've still got about 20 pounds of C4 explosive in my pack. If we could somehow get it up to their ammunition storage area, We might be able to create enough chaos to give our guys a chance to escape." Sarah looked at him through her night vision goggles. Williams was tough as nails, but his injuries were severe and he could barely move. "Tommy, you can barely walk. How are you going to get up that cliff?" "I'm not," he replied grimly. "But you are. You're the only one here with the skills to make that climb and the shooting ability to cover yourself on the way up." The plan was insane. Sarah would have to leave her protected position, cross open ground under heavy fire, climb a nearly vertical cliff face, locate the enemy ammunition supplies, plant explosives, and somehow get back down alive. The chances of survival were almost zero. But as she looked around at her fellow Marines, she saw that they were running out of options. Medical supplies were gone, ammunition was low, and more soldiers were being wounded every minute. The enemy was in no hurry. They could simply wait for the Marines to run out of ammunition and then finish them off at their leisure. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio with an update that made the situation even worse. "All units, be advised. Intercepted communications indicate enemy reinforcements are en route. We have approximately 30 minutes before this gets much worse." Sarah made her decision. She began stripping unnecessary equipment from her gear, keeping only her rifle, sidearm, climbing rope, and Williams's explosives. Every ounce of weight would make the climb more difficult, and speed would be her only advantage. "Cover me," she told Williams as she prepared to move. "And if I don't make it back, make sure Rodriguez knows this whole mission was a setup from the beginning." She sprinted from her cover position, using the smoke and dust from recent mortar strikes to conceal her movement. Enemy bullets cracked through the air around her as she zigzagged across the valley floor. But her training kicked in and she moved with the fluid grace of a seasoned combat veteran. The base of the western cliff was littered with loose rocks and debris, making the climb treacherous even without enemy fire. Sarah found a route that offered some protection from the shooters on the eastern cliff, but she was still exposed to fighters positioned directly above her. As she began climbing, using her rope to secure herself to small ledges and rock formations, she could hear the battle continuing below. Her fellow Marines were fighting desperately to stay alive, but they were clearly losing ground. Every few seconds, another cry for a medic echoed through the valley. Halfway up the cliff, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. A group of 3 enemy fighters had spotted her and were trying to position themselves to get a clear shot. She had to make a choice: continue climbing and hope they missed, or stop and engage them in a firefight that would alert every enemy in the area to her position. She chose to fight. Hanging from her climbing rope with one hand, she drew her sidearm and fired 3 quick shots. All 3 enemies dropped, but the gunfire had definitely been heard by other fighters in the area. Sarah continued climbing as fast as she could, knowing that enemy reinforcements would be searching for her within minutes. The ammunition storage area was still 200 feet above her, and she could already hear voices calling out in a foreign language as the enemy began organizing a search. Her muscles burned from the strain of climbing while carrying the extra weight of the explosives, and her wounded forehead kept bleeding into her eyes. But she pushed herself harder than she ever had before, because she knew that 480 Marines were counting on her to succeed. As she neared the top of the cliff, Sarah could see the enemy camp spread out before her. There were more fighters than she had estimated, and they had enough weapons and ammunition to keep her battalion pinned down for days. But she also spotted what she was looking for: a large cache of ammunition boxes and fuel containers that would make an excellent target for Williams's explosives. Sarah reached the top of the cliff and immediately took cover behind a large boulder. The enemy camp was more extensive than she had imagined from below. Dozens of fighters moved between positions, carrying ammunition and coordinating their attacks on the trapped Marines. She could see the ammunition storage area about 100 yards away, heavily guarded and surrounded by fuel containers that would amplify any explosion. But there was a problem. Between her position and the target area, at least 20 enemy fighters were positioned in a way that made it impossible to approach without being detected. She would need a distraction, something that would draw their attention away long enough for her to plant the explosives. Through her scope, Sarah identified a communication station where several enemy leaders were coordinating the attack. If she could eliminate the commanders and destroy their radio equipment, it might create enough confusion to give her the opportunity she needed. She steadied her rifle and took careful aim at the first target. The shot was perfect, dropping the enemy commander instantly. Before the other fighters could react, She had eliminated 2 more key personnel and destroyed their main radio with precise shots. The enemy camp erupted in chaos as fighters scrambled to understand where the shots were coming from. Sarah used this confusion to move toward the ammunition storage area, staying low and using the natural terrain for cover. She reached the edge of the storage area just as enemy searchers were spreading out to find her. Working quickly, she began placing Williams's explosives around the ammunition boxes and fuel containers, setting timer charges that would give her enough time to escape before the explosion. But as she worked, Sarah heard footsteps approaching her position. 3 enemy fighters had spotted her and were closing in fast. She had 2 choices: fight them and risk alerting the entire camp to her location, or try to hide and hope they didn't find the explosives she had already placed. She decided to fight. Drawing her sidearm, she engaged all 3 enemies in close combat, using her training in hand-to-hand fighting when her ammunition ran low. The fight was brutal and desperate, but she managed to eliminate all 3 attackers without raising a general alarm. However, the fight had cost her precious time. The timer on her explosives was counting down, and she still needed to get back down the cliff before they detonated. Sarah finished placing the last charges and began running toward her climbing rope. As she reached the edge of the cliff, enemy voices behind her indicated that more fighters were approaching the storage area. She had maybe 2 minutes before the explosives went off, and she needed to be far enough down the cliff to survive the blast. Sarah began rappelling down the cliff face as fast as she dared, using controlled falls to cover distance quickly. Below her, the battle in the valley continued to rage, but she could see that her fellow Marines were in increasingly desperate situations. Several more vehicles were destroyed, and the enemy was preparing for a final assault that would finish off the remaining defenders. She was still 50 feet from the bottom when the explosives detonated above her. The explosion was massive, far larger than she had expected. The ammunition and fuel had created a chain reaction that lit up the entire night sky and sent shockwaves through both cliff faces. The blast threw Sarah against the rock wall, stunning her and causing her to lose control of her rappelling rope. She fell the remaining distance, landing hard among the rocks at the base of the cliff. Pain shot through her left shoulder and ribs, but she was alive. The explosion had achieved exactly what she had hoped. The enemy camp above was in complete chaos, with fighters running in all directions and many of their heavy weapons destroyed or abandoned. Secondary explosions continued to rock the cliff as more ammunition stores caught fire. But Sarah's mission wasn't complete. The explosion had disrupted the enemy's coordinated attack, but there were still dozens of fighters positioned on both sides of the valley. Her fellow Marines needed more help if they were going to escape this trap alive. She grabbed her rifle and began moving toward a new position where she could provide sniper support for her battalion. Her left arm wasn't working properly, and she could feel broken ribs grinding together with each breath. But she pushed through the pain. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, filled with amazement and hope. "Unknown friendly, that was outstanding work. We have enemy fighters retreating from the western positions. All units prepare to move on my command." Sarah smiled despite her pain. She had given her fellow Marines a chance, but the fight wasn't over yet. The enemy still had superior numbers and positions, and reinforcements were still on the way. She needed to find a way to tip the balance even further in favor of the trapped battalion. Through her scope, she began identifying the enemy fighters who were trying to reorganize their defense. If she could eliminate their remaining leadership and key weapons positions, the Marines might actually have a chance to fight their way out of the valley alive. The massive explosion on the western cliff had created exactly the opening Rodriguez needed. Through the chaos and confusion, he could see enemy fighters abandoning their positions and running toward the burning ammunition depot. This was their chance to break out of the death trap. "All units, this is actual," Rodriguez commanded over the radio. "Execute breakout maneuver Alpha 7. Move to the northern exit route in 60 seconds. Sarah repositioned herself to provide overwatch for the Marine evacuation. Despite her injuries, she began systematically eliminating enemy fighters who were trying to reorganize their defense. Each shot was carefully calculated to create maximum disruption in the enemy ranks. But as the Marines began their desperate escape attempt, Sarah noticed something that filled her with dread. Through her scope, she could see headlights approaching from the south. The enemy reinforcements had arrived earlier than expected. Dozens of vehicles were racing toward the valley, carrying fresh fighters and heavy weapons that would trap the Marines all over again. She immediately radioed Rodriguez with the devastating news. "Actual, this is Chen. Large enemy force approaching from the south, approximately 5 minutes out. At least 40 vehicles with heavy weapons." Rodriguez felt his heart sink. His Marines had just started their breakout attempt, but they were still scattered across the valley floor and vulnerable. If fresh enemy forces reached the valley before his people could escape, they would be trapped again with no chance of survival. "All units, increase speed. We have incoming hostiles," Rodriguez ordered. But he knew it might already be too late. Sarah realized that someone needed to slow down the approaching reinforcements, or all of her efforts would be worthless. The only position that offered a clear view of the southern approach was a high ridge on the eastern cliff, the same cliff that was still crawling with enemy fighters. Without hesitation, she began climbing again. Her broken ribs sent waves of pain through her body with each movement, and her injured shoulder made it nearly impossible to grip the rope properly. But she pushed herself upward, knowing that this was the Marine's last chance. As she climbed, Sarah could hear the vehicles getting closer. The enemy reinforcements would reach the valley in just a few minutes, and her fellow Marines were still only halfway to the northern exit. She needed to reach the ridge and start engaging the convoy immediately. Enemy fighters on the eastern cliff had noticed her movement and were trying to intercept her. Bullets cracked against the rocks around her as she climbed, but she continued upward with grim determination. Every second counted now. Sarah reached the ridge just as the first enemy vehicles entered the southern end of the valley. She could see the convoy clearly through her scope. Trucks loaded with fighters, vehicles carrying heavy machine guns, and even a few pieces of light artillery that could devastate the escaping Marines. She took aim at the lead vehicle and fired. The shot struck the driver, causing the truck to veer off the road and crash into a boulder. The convoy was forced to stop while the damaged vehicle was cleared, buying the Marines precious additional time. But Sarah's position was now known to every enemy in the area. Fighters from both cliff faces were converging on her location, and she was trapped on the ridge with nowhere to retreat. She had maybe 5 minutes before she would be overwhelmed. She continued engaging the convoy, targeting drivers and gunners to create maximum chaos. Each shot forced the enemy to take cover or change their approach, slowing their advance toward the valley. But there were too many vehicles and not enough time. Rodriguez and his Marines had reached the northern valley exit, but they were still exposed to fire from the eastern cliff positions. Sarah could see that several Marines had been hit during the escape attempt, and they needed covering fire to complete their breakout. She made an impossible choice. Turning away from the convoy, she began engaging the eastern cliff positions that were threatening her fellow Marines. Each shot eliminated an enemy fighter, but it also meant the convoy was free to continue advancing toward the valley. "Chen, get out of there," Rodriguez called over the radio. "We're almost clear." "Negative, sir," Sarah replied, continuing to fire at enemy positions. "Someone needs to cover your escape route. Keep moving." The pain from her injuries was becoming overwhelming, and she was running low on ammunition. Enemy fighters were closing in on her position from multiple directions, and the convoy had resumed its advance toward the valley. In a few more minutes, the Marines would be trapped again, but Sarah had one more idea. She still had 2 grenades attached to her belt, and the ridge she was positioned on overlooked a narrow section of the road where the convoy would have to pass. If she could create a landslide at just the right moment, she might be able to block the road and give the Marines the time they needed to complete their escape. She began moving toward the edge of the ridge, where loose rocks and debris could be triggered into an avalanche. Behind her, enemy voices were getting closer as the fighters searched for her exact position. She had maybe 30 seconds before they found her. Sarah positioned herself at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the narrow road where the enemy convoy would have to pass. The geological formation was perfect for her plan. Centuries of weathering had left massive boulders balanced precariously on the cliff face, held in place by only a few key support points. She pulled the pins from both grenades and placed them at strategic locations where the explosions would trigger the largest possible rock slide. The convoy was now less than 200 yards away, close enough that she could see individual fighters preparing their weapons for the final assault on the Marines. Behind her, Sarah could hear enemy fighters calling out to each other as they searched the ridge. They were getting closer, and she had maybe 15 seconds before they found her position. She needed to time the grenades perfectly, Too early and the convoy could find another route. Too late and the Marines would be trapped. The lead vehicles of the convoy entered the narrow section of road just as Sarah heard footsteps directly behind her. She triggered the grenades and immediately dove for cover behind a large boulder, as both enemy gunfire and the explosion erupted simultaneously. The grenades detonated with devastating effect. The carefully balanced boulders began tumbling down the cliff face, creating an avalanche that completely blocked the road and crushed several enemy vehicles. The convoy was stopped cold with no way to reach the valley where the Marines were making their escape. But Sarah's victory came at a terrible cost. Enemy bullets had found their target during her exposed position at the cliff edge. She felt the impact of at least 2 shots, one in her right leg and another in her back. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, and she knew these wounds were serious. She tried to move, but her leg wouldn't support her weight. Blood was spreading across her uniform, and she could feel her strength fading rapidly. The enemy fighters were still searching for her, and it was only a matter of time before they found her hiding spot behind the boulder. Through her fading vision, Sarah could see the Marine convoy in the distance. They had successfully reached the northern valley exit and were beginning to establish a defensive perimeter in safer terrain. Rodriguez was maintaining radio contact with each unit, making sure all wounded were accounted for and treated. "Chen, report your status." Rodriguez called over the radio. "We're in position to provide covering fire for your escape." Sarah tried to respond, but speaking required more strength than she had left. The radio fell from her hand as she struggled to stay conscious. She had accomplished her mission. The 480 Marines were safe and the enemy reinforcements were blocked. But she wasn't going to be able to join them. The enemy fighters were very close now. She could hear them checking behind rocks and debris, systematically searching every possible hiding spot on the ridge. They would find her within the next few minutes, and in her current condition, she wouldn't be able to fight back. Sarah thought about her family back home, her parents who had been so proud when she joined the Marines, and her younger brother who had followed her example and enlisted the previous year. She thought about all the Marines whose lives she had saved tonight, soldiers who would go home to their own families because of her actions. Despite her pain and exhaustion, she felt a sense of peace. She had done her job. She had protected her fellow Marines and upheld the values that had driven her to become a soldier in the first place. Whatever happened next, she could face it knowing that she had made a difference. The enemy voices were now just a few yards away. Sarah used her last reserves of strength to grip her sidearm, determined to take as many enemies with her as possible. If this was where her story ended, she was going to make sure it was a story worth telling. But just as the first enemy fighter appeared around the edge of her boulder, Sarah heard a sound that filled her with hope. It was the distinctive roar of helicopter engines growing louder by the second. The weather had cleared enough for air support to finally reach the area. "All enemy forces, this is Cobra Flight Leader," came the voice over the radio frequency that enemy fighters were monitoring. "You are surrounded and outgunned. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." The Apache helicopters appeared over the ridge like avenging angels, their weapon systems locked onto the enemy positions. The fighters who had been hunting Sarah suddenly found themselves being hunted by some of the most advanced military aircraft in the world. Within minutes, the entire tactical situation had reversed. The enemy fighters were either dead, captured, or fleeing in terror as the helicopters systematically eliminated their positions. The convoy trapped by Sarah's rockslide was completely destroyed, and any enemies who hadn't been caught in the initial strike were being pursued by ground forces that had arrived with the air support. Sarah heard Rodriguez's voice over the radio, filled with relief and gratitude. "Medical team to the eastern ridge immediately. We have a Marine who needs immediate evacuation." She smiled despite her pain, knowing that her fellow Marines were coming to bring her home. The medical evacuation helicopter landed on the ridge 20 minutes later, its rotor wash clearing away the smoke and dust from the recent battle. Navy corpsmen rushed to Sarah's position, immediately beginning emergency treatment for her wounds while preparing her for transport to the nearest military hospital. "Stay with us, Chen," called out Hospital Corpsman Second Class Maria Santos as she worked to stabilize Sarah's condition. "You're going to be fine. You've got too much fight in you to quit now." Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness during the helicopter flight, but she could hear radio chatter confirming that all 480 Marines from her battalion had been successfully evacuated from the valley. The enemy ambush had been completely defeated, and intelligence teams were already analyzing the captured equipment and documents to prevent similar attacks in the future. 3 days later, Sarah woke up in a military hospital in Germany. Her injuries were severe but not life-threatening. The doctors had successfully removed the bullets and repaired the damage to her leg and back. She would need months of rehabilitation, but she was expected to make a full recovery. Captain Rodriguez was the first person to visit her in the hospital. He sat beside her bed with a mixture of gratitude and amazement on his face. "Chen, what you did out there was beyond extraordinary," he said quietly. The investigation team confirmed that the entire mission was based on false intelligence planted by enemy agents. They knew exactly where we would be and when we would arrive. Without your actions, we would have lost every single Marine in that battalion. Sarah tried to sit up but winced from the pain. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Any Marine would have done the same thing." Rodriguez shook his head. "No, Sarah, what you did was far beyond the call of duty. You single-handedly turned a massacre into a victory. The preliminary reports indicate you eliminated at least 40 enemy fighters, destroyed their ammunition depot, and stopped their reinforcements. You saved 480 lives." Over the following weeks, Sarah's story spread throughout the military. News of the female sniper who had saved an entire Marine battalion captured the attention of military leaders and the general public alike. She received visits from high-ranking officers, members of Congress, and even family members of the Marines whose lives she had saved. The official investigation revealed the full extent of the enemy trap. Intelligence agencies discovered that enemy operatives had been planning the ambush for months, using false information and corrupted communication channels to lure American forces into the deadly valley. It was one of the most sophisticated ambush operations ever attempted against U.S. military forces. Sarah was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for heroism, in a ceremony attended by all 480 Marines she had saved, as she stood on the stage in her dress uniform. Still using a cane to support her injured leg, she looked out at the faces of her fellow Marines and their families. Many of the Marines had brought their wives, children, and parents to the ceremony. Sarah realized that her actions hadn't just saved 480 Marines, they had also preserved hundreds of families, ensuring that children wouldn't grow up without fathers, that wives wouldn't become widows, and that parents wouldn't have to bury their sons. Staff Sergeant Williams, whose explosives had made the cliff assault possible, was also honored for his contribution to the mission. He had recovered from his injuries and returned to active duty, but he made sure everyone knew that Sarah was the real hero of that night. "She took my crazy idea and turned it into something that actually worked," Williams said during his speech. "But more than that, she showed all of us what it means to be a Marine. When her fellow soldiers needed her most, she was willing to risk everything to save them." After the ceremony, Sarah was offered various positions within the military, including opportunities to train other snipers and work with special operations forces. But she chose to return to her original unit, working alongside the same Marines she had fought so hard to save. "These are my people," she explained to her commanding officers. "We've been through something together that creates bonds stronger than family. My place is with them." The valley where the ambush occurred was eventually turned into a training facility where military personnel learn about the importance of questioning intelligence, recognizing ambush situations, and working together as a team to overcome impossible odds. A memorial plaque was installed at the site, honoring Sarah's actions and reminding future generations of Marines about the courage and sacrifice that defines their service. Sarah Chen continued her military career, eventually becoming a training instructor who taught thousands of Marines the skills and mindset needed to protect their fellow soldiers. She never considered herself a hero, but to the 480 Marines whose lives she saved and to their families, she would always be the person who refused to give up when giving up seemed like the only option. The story of that night in the valley became legendary within military circles, passed down from one generation of Marines to the next. It served as a reminder that sometimes when everything seems lost and defeat appears certain, one person with enough courage and determination can change the entire outcome of a battle. Sarah Chen had proven that heroism isn't about being fearless, but about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. Years later, when military historians analyzed the engagement, they concluded that it represented one of the most successful individual combat actions in modern warfare history. The tactical situation had been impossible. 480 Marines trapped in a kill zone with no air support, no escape routes, and facing overwhelming enemy forces. By all military calculations, the entire battalion should have been wiped out within hours. But Sarah's actions had changed those calculations completely. Her destruction of the enemy ammunition depot had eliminated their ability to sustain a prolonged siege. Her disruption of their command structure had prevented coordinated attacks. Her blocking of the reinforcement convoy had ensured that the numerical advantage remained manageable. Most importantly, her willingness to sacrifice herself had given her fellow Marines the inspiration and opportunity they needed to fight their way to safety. The enemy forces involved in the ambush were later identified as elite fighters who had been responsible for successful attacks against military units from several different countries. They had never failed to eliminate their targets until they encountered Sarah Chen and the Marines of her battalion. In the years that followed, Sarah received numerous awards and recognition from military organizations around the world. Foreign governments invited her to speak at their military academies, and her tactics were studied and incorporated into training programs across multiple branches of service. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 10 years after the battle, Sarah received a letter from the daughter of one of the Marines she had saved. The little girl, now a teenager, had written to thank her for making sure her father came home from his deployment. "My dad tells me stories about you," the letter read. "He says you're the reason I got to grow up with my father, and the reason my little brother got to meet him. I'm joining the Marines when I graduate from high school, and I hope I can be as brave as you were that night." Sarah kept that letter in her desk drawer and read it whenever she wondered whether the pain and sacrifice had been worth it. The answer was always the same. Every injury she had sustained, every moment of fear she had experienced, and every risk she had taken was insignificant compared to the lives she had preserved and the families she had kept together. The failed ambush in the valley marked the beginning of the end for the enemy organization that had planned it. The intelligence gathered from captured documents and equipment led to successful operations against their other cells, ultimately dismantling the entire network. The enemy's most sophisticated and successful unit had been destroyed by a single Marine who refused to accept defeat. Sarah Chen's story became more than just a military legend. It became a symbol of what individuals can accomplish when they refuse to give up on the people they care about. Her actions that night proved that sometimes the most impossible missions become possible when someone is willing to risk everything for their fellow soldiers. The 480 Marines she saved went on to complete successful military careers, start families, build businesses, and contribute to their communities in countless ways. Each of their achievements and the achievements of their children and grandchildren could be traced back to that night when one female sniper decided that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet.